Official and formal good evening to everyone. We've hit the record button and we are about to get underway in our study of the book of Judges. And so we'll just open up to Judges chapter 1 and kind of ask the question, what now? So the conclusion of the book of Joshua contained some challenges to perseverance. And Joshua expects the people to make their own decision to serve the Lord and to reject the idols of the world around them. And Judges 1 kind of begins with, in a fairly hopeful way, that people are going to continue on this path that the Lord has in front of them. So in Judges chapter 1, we see that some good carries over. First of all, as the book opens up, now, after the death of Joshua, it came to pass, the children of Israel asked the Lord, saying, who shall be the first to go up for us against the Canaanites to fight against them? There's this understanding that we need to continue the battle. And the place they go to ask, what do we have to do about this battle? They go to God. And so we have seen that being an issue for them in the book of Joshua at times, not stopping and considering what God wanted. And so that is there from the beginning, which is good. And then when they do receive that message from the Lord, they ultimately respond with both obedience and, in obedience, cooperation, which though the intention of Joshua was that people would begin to fight these battles on their own, this is still the people of God, and they still have the ability to work together. And in this case, it makes a lot of sense because though Judah is the one sent on this mission, Simeon's inheritance is scattered in Judah, and so their lot is kind of tied together. And so they aren't passive participants in receiving their own blessing. They're going to work with Judah to receive what God has allotted for them. So Judah is the one that God wants to go up. It says in verse number 2. So Judah says, well, come on, let's go. And we see, by the way, if you're wondering about that, you might have said, Judah shall go up. Well, is that a person named Judah? And is this another person named Simeon? I actually sat through a sermon once where the man who presented that sermon preached it that way, like Judah was a guy and Simeon was another guy. And yet it's kind of borne out as, this reading continues, that we're not really talking about, Judah and as an individual, but rather, as it says in verse number 8, the children of Judah. We're talking about the people of that tribe. So yes, the tribe, and that follows that format throughout the rest of this chapter, where you have the tribes being named and what they do or do not do. So anyway, the tribe of Judah and the tribe of Simeon work together, and as a consequence, we find they go up in verse 4, and the Lord delivers the Canaanites and the Perizzites into their hand, and so they are successful. And that is something that does continue. The first of these big bad guys comes up in Judges, and as soon as he comes, he leaves. Adonai-Bezek is identified, can be identified as obviously a very successful king in his own right. He is able to say that 70 kings, he had this weird habit of cutting off the thumbs and big toes of the people that he defeated, and then having them sort of live in his court and be subservient to him and dependent upon him. I don't know why it is that not having your toes and your thumbs is going to make you subservient to someone, or why he had this kind of idea of doing these things, but that's what he did. And
in
so
similar historical situations, I've seen
the
removal of the thumb makes it essentially impossible to hold a sword or a spear, any weapon, right? You can't grasp a weapon anymore, and it's very hard to run without your big toe. It kind of puts you off balance, especially if it doesn't heal well, as it might not with the surgery they had there. So these, once mighty men can no longer hold weapons and they can no longer run. They've functionally been crippled. But in such a way where, maybe cutting off arms or legs or things, you might accidentally kill the guy very easily. This is, the minimal chopping need to do to, mutilate someone and make them reliant on other people now, essentially.
But you kind of see the same thing happening as happened with Joshua, and where they put their feet on the necks of the kings that had taken refuge in the cave. They catch Adonai-Bezek and they cut off his thumbs and his big toes. And so a story of victory continues in the way that they in a way that they can understand and grasp in their time period. What I say. I just think it's kind of a little bit silly, but anyway, maybe just me. And there's times where I find funny what others want to take very seriously, Nicholas. So, but anyway, so victory over fearsome opposition. He's defeated 70 kings, and they defeat him. That says a lot about the story of the Lord moving forward. And then you ultimately find that there are pictures of them as the chapter continues, of them claiming what was rightfully theirs. And so you find other successes of Judah and some of the other tribes, to a lesser degree, mentioned in these opening verses. There is also some sense of continuance that's sort of woven into the text. The Bible gets attacked for doing this kind of thing, but for those who believe in inspiration and who don't doubt that Judges is the product of it, why would it be that Joshua 15, 16 through 19 is sort of quoted almost verbatim here in Judges chapter 1, verses 12 through 15? What might be the value of doing that, of retelling that story? There's a practical benefit of the fact that Othniel will be brought up in chapter 3, and in chapter 3. And we don't have to give his background story because we've given it here effectively. But what else might that, be symbolic of, that we've got this account from Joshua restated for us here in the book of Judges?
Well, what you have on screen is some sense of continuance.
Yeah, right.
Yep. That it does definitely connect it. These would be separate manuscripts, they'd be separate documents, scrolls, however, that they had them split up. I know some of the longer books were often, even set up into multiple scrolls for ease of use. And so it definitely connects the two separate works as part of the greater whole, by kind of almost, having them be, what's the opposite of a bookend? It's the end of one and the start of the other. But that mirroring there. Yeah, because it's not enclosing
a book
one thing. Well, yeah, but it's not enclosing one thing. It's closing one thing and then opening the other.
Yeah, so
like
sort of
join to something.
Yeah, you can think of like a sort of link in the chain kind of thing or something like that. I don't know. But
I'm
yeah,
sure there's some term for it.
Yeah, right. There's a term for almost everything in the English language, like there's like 32,000 words, and so we just don't always know all of them. But right, there's like I said, there's some sense of continuance that the and also a picture of the way things ought to be. Like as we said, Simeon is working with Judah. You have this responsiveness to the call for action from Caleb of Othniel. You have wisdom and foresight, and a willingness to be blessed in this daughter, Aksha, or whatever, however you say her name. And so it's a story of the way that things are meant to work, but we're going to see that story unfortunately doesn't continue. But at least while they were continuing in the path that the Lord had for them, the Lord was with them, and that's stated a couple of times. The Lord was with Judah, verse 19, and also it says the Lord was with the house of Joseph and what they were trying to do. And we'll talk about that even though the Lord was with them, that already, at least in the case of the house of Joseph, they weren't necessarily with the Lord. So, as I said, there is a continuing of the story of the book of Joshua, but there are also some chinks beginning to appear in the armor. And in isolation, these things might have, you say, well, we could still move forward after this because we saw that in the book of Joshua. It wasn't as though they did everything perfectly, but they tell, as the chapter continues, an overwhelming story of this not continuing in the Lord's path and then sort of giving up on what the Lord desires. So Judah itself, for all of the things that they did well that are highlighted in the early part of this chapter, it says in verse 19 that they could not drive out the inhabitants of the plains or the lowland because those people had chariots of iron. And we're like, well, what's the big deal with that? We're going to get to, chapter 3 or rather chapter 4, and we'll see, Jabin and Sisera and their chariots of iron. And that doesn't amount to very much in that chapter, nor has it previously amounted to very much. We've seen the Israelites previously defeat people with chariots of iron. So what's the big deal? Well, the big deal is clearly that they did not do what they had every opportunity to do, perhaps because of fear, maybe because they didn't continue to do what the Lord said or inquire of him. We're not told why they did not succeed or why they didn't pursue it, but they allowed those chariots to be an obstacle. Then, as the reading continues, you find about the children of Benjamin, and they didn't drive out the Jebusites who inhabited Jerusalem. So there is a victory that's won over Jerusalem, but they allow the Jebusites to dwell there and to dwell with them. So a sort of compromise with the people who live there, rather than being obedient to the Lord's command to drive them out. But then, in addition to failure and compromise, you see these sort of pragmatic approaches rather than being responsive to faith. When Joseph went up to Bethel, the Lord was with them, and they do what they're kind of allowed to do. They send the spies to spy out the town of Bethel. It says in verse 23, and notice the little detail there. The name of the city was formerly called Luz, and then it says in verse 24 that the spies see a man coming out of the city. They say, "Show us the entrance of the city, and we'll show you mercy." Now, you can read that kind of a detail and be like, well, that's kind of what happened with with Rahab, right? I mean, what's the big deal about that? But how did the conversation begin, and what do we not see present in this man that we saw present in Rahab? So what makes you feel good about the spies making an agreement with Rahab as you're reading Joshua chapter 2? What makes you feel good about that?
Is it because this man didn't believe in God?
Yeah, there's nothing here about this man believing in God. We don't find that he's heard about God and he wants to help the Israelites. We don't even find that he's using deception, like we saw the what are they called, the Gibeonites of the book of Joshua. We saw them saying, "Oh, we tricked you because we had faith in your God." We don't see anything like that, but rather we see some spies kind of looking for the easy route, looking to take a shortcut, looking to just do something purely pragmatically because it works. So we find that happens. The man does show them the entrance to the city. They are able to take the city. They honor their word, which I guess is what they ought to do. But should they have given their word in the first place? Well, here especially, we would say no. We find that the man goes out, and this has to be purposeful. That the man goes out, he builds a city, and he calls its name Luz, which it is called to this day. So what is does anybody know what the name, I mean, you don't always have to know what names of places mean, but this place that they're taking is going to be renamed Bethel. What does Bethel mean, or Beit El? What is that?
Is that daughter of God?
No, not daughter of God, but kind of like Bethlehem. What is the Beth part of that? Beth ends up being a woman's name sometimes, but
I couldn't remember if it was like the feminine version of Ben or not.
no, it's house. So
okay.
it's the Hebrew word for house. So like, and you remember like when Jacob sees the vision of the ladder, he calls this Bethel. He's like, this is the house of God because I saw this ladder descending, from heaven with the angels going up and down. So this is where God lives. And so Bethel is house of God. Bethlehem, by the way, is the house of bread. And a little side note, in case we don't get to the book of Ruth, when you're reading Ruth, maybe don't think pragmatically about that opening, kind of what happens there, where Naomi and her family, they leave Bethlehem because of a famine and go down into Moab. So that's kind of a little bit purposeful. They've left the house of bread in search of bread. And then what happens? Well, a lot of bad stuff happens. I mean, something good ends up coming of it, but Naomi loses her entire family effectively because of that decision to leave the house of bread. But anyway, so they are going to take this city called Luz or Lutz or whatever, Luz, I don't know. They take this city and they rename it Bethel. But then this guy goes out and he creates Luz again. So we've lost one Luz and we've gained another, So clearly, again, things haven't changed. At least in the eyes of this man, they should not have made that agreement. At least it doesn't seem like they should have. You also find some pragmatic treatments of the defeated rather than obedience to again drive them out. We find that when Israel's strong, they put the Canaanites under tribute or under forced labor, but they did not completely drive them out. And so happy to receive money and or servanthood from those whom they defeat, not happy to do what God has told them to do and totally driving them out of the land. There's also, therefore, as the text continues, an increasing number of failures. So you can see these kind of like compromises or semi-failures, and then all of a sudden now we start getting they did not over and over again as the text continues, and so failure over and over again, and then after all of that, the text concludes with the Gentiles beginning to push back, and then ultimately they're the ones who are victorious. In verse 34, the Amorites forced the children of Dan to the mountains, for they would not allow them to come down to the valley. And so the Amorites are dictating terms rather than God and his people. The Amorites were determined to dwell in Mount Heres, and so they had determination, and they're the ones who were able to succeed. So what now? Again, story of faithfulness of Joshua does not continue. So questions or comments over chapter 1 before we move on to chapter 2?
Kind of a bit of a dark irony there that they're taking these pragmatic responses, and the whole point of pragmatism is you think that's the most efficient way to get things done, way to get to the ends you want. But because they're going against what God wants them to do, their ends justifies the means actions actually ends up with them getting not the ends that they want. So it's counterproductive on every level. Now they're doing the wrong thing to get to the wrong place. Instead of doing the right thing and getting to where they want to be.
Exactly. Pragmatism is never God's approach to a problem. God doesn't choose things merely because they work. Now, sometimes God does choose what works, but that's not the only or the primary consideration for God. I mean, and we're going to see that as the text continues. In the case of especially Gideon, pragmatism would be keep all the soldiers that you have, and not see your army be reduced, in number. But how do we get to this point? So the text opens up in Judges chapter 2 with these failures sort of setting them up for failure. At least at this point, as is recorded in the text, they do seem to be responsive, and you get a little sense of like what's the chronology here, because we saw in chapter 1 there's a little bit of overlap with the book of Joshua. Most people are conclude though that by the end of Judges we've moved past the time of Joshua and we're really talking about what happens in the next generation. And so they would have us approach chapter 2 more sort of thematically than chronologically, and I think that's probably accurate. So let's read the some of these what happens here in verses 1 through 5, and see kind of where they are, and then how the story is told as the text continues. So the angel of the Lord came up and said in verse 1, I led you up from Egypt and brought you to the land which I swore to your fathers. And I said, I will never break my covenant with you. You shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall tear down their altars, but you have not obeyed my voice. Why have you done this? Therefore I also said, I will not drive them out before you. They shall be as thorns in your side, and their God shall be as a snare to you. And so it was when the angel of the Lord had spoken these words to all the people, the children of Israel, and the people lifted up their voices and wept. And so early on, that's what it takes. They see failure. They're explained why this failure is, and initially they are responsive to that. And they're calling upon the name of the Lord. Why is that? Well, because there was sort of a growing hardness of heart amongst the people, and it's often that way. Hebrews chapter 2 verses 1 through 4 describes the sort of the need to really embrace the message of salvation, to hold on to that message, because as verse 1 talks about, we have a tendency to let things sort of slip away. And one of the things that's stood out to me about that text is the word that's chosen there for lest at any time we should let them slip. That word for slip, or however your version might read there, is a word that the Greeks would sometimes use for a ship that was kind of going into the water from the land, kind of sliding into the water. And that's so often how it is when that path to departure begins. It's very easy to recognize it and to be responsive to God. But as they continue to persist in the path of sin, their hearts grow harder, and God has to speak more loudly for his message to be heard. And their return, as we're going to see, is not going to be as emphatic or even as durative. They're not going to be responsive for as long. In verse 6, you have this mention of Joshua again. You're wondering, well, chronologically that doesn't quite fit, but only to the extent that we see, kind of the point made in verse 10. When all that generation had been gathered to their fathers, another generation arose after them who did not know the Lord nor the work which he had done for Israel. So really, that's not so much about chronology, but explaining again that Joshua's generation was good, but when it passed, a generation arose that was very different. So the question that you have to pause and ask is, when they did not know God, was that a failure in Joshua's generation to convey God to the next generation? Or was it a failure in the generation that followed to acknowledge God? What are your thoughts about that? What signs do we get that Joshua's generation was concerned with conveying messages to the next generation?
You have the altar of witness between the tribes of Manasseh and the eastern tribes.
Yeah,
and then you also have the ferocious conquests. So I think overall it's more like our new generation's fault that they're not they're not following God.
Yeah. What else was there besides that? Because that altar of witness certainly was something that was them preparing for a future where they were worried people might forget the connection between the tribes on the east with the tribes on the west. But what else did they build by way of preparing for the future?
Isn't the Ark of the Covenant and the Tabernacle also for the future?
Well, that's certainly there in Israel. We're talking about Joshua's generation in particular. They may remember some things that they did for the sake of trying to teach the next generation. There's two things that come to my mind. What about when they crossed the river? What did they do after they crossed the river?
They made an altar and sacrificed burnt offerings and grain offerings.
Besides that, what did they take from the river? What did they do with what they took?
They put 5 stones at the bottom of the river?
Well, that wouldn't be very helpful to put stones at the bottom of the river. Maybe something a little different. Does anybody else remember?
Yeah. They took the stones from the bottom of the river
And how many
and
did they
carried
take?
them out. And I believe it was 12, right? One
There were
per tribe.
12 stones, yeah. So
Yeah.
one for each tribe.
If the Israelites can do something with a number that's 12,
Yeah,
man, they will try to get it to be 12.
yeah, that's right. So they took 12 stones from out of the river. They didn't put them at the bottom of the river, so they took them out of the river, and they did that to create a memorial for future generations to be able to know what the Lord had done. So we see them doing that. And the other thing that comes to mind is what Joshua did at Ebal and Gerizim. Does anybody remember what he did?
I remember that there was a reading of the law. I can't remember if there was a monument built on the 2 mountains.
Yeah, so Joshua actually carved out the law on
Nice.
on rocks there. So that kind of speaks to an intentionality. Both of those things speak to an intentionality of actually trying to preserve the message from the next generation. It is certainly possible that though we see this diligence in Joshua, that maybe this diligence didn't take place in every you know person. I know that I've very often heard the message made that the generation failed to teach the next generation because they're focusing on our understanding of the word no, but sometimes the word no doesn't convey a informational knowledge as much as it confers a relational knowledge. So the very same word, and I haven't double checked to see this word here, but the very same word that so often is translated as no, is the word that you've probably heard the kind of the Yiddish kind of slang way of saying it, yada yada yada, right? What does that mean? It actually means I know. You're trying to, and that's what the word means. And so but that same word is used in Genesis 5 to talk about what Adam and Eve did to produce Seth. Like Adam knew his wife and then Seth is born. Well, what I know a lot of people, it doesn't mean the child is produced, but the word implies also the idea of relational knowledge. And so don't think that just because someone it said like they didn't know the Lord, that doesn't necessarily mean that they weren't told about the Lord or that his message wasn't conveyed to them. It could also mean that perhaps they just chose not to have a relationship with him, not to pursue a relationship with him, and not to have any kind of intimate knowledge. So like when the same kind of language is used of Pharaoh, a Pharaoh arose who did not know Joseph. Is it like, well, where did all these Israelites come from? I don't know who they are, where they came from. Or is it he chose not to honor what his predecessors were doing in continuing a relationship with Israel because of Joseph? Probably something more like that, I think. So anyway, both things are worth considering. By the way, just to think, if you, as a takeaway lesson from this text, reflect upon the importance of conveying to the next generation what God has done, and also pause and reflect upon how you take what you know about God and you internalize it and try to form a relationship with him. Both of those things are worthy takeaways from that idea. But anyway, Joshua is said to have left the nations. It says in Joshua 23 and verse 4, Joshua says, see, I have divided to you by a lot these nations that remain to be inheritance for your tribes. So it says, Joshua says, I left you the nations, but really what this text conveys is that it was God who left the nations. In chapter 2, verse 23, therefore the Lord left those nations without driving them out immediately, nor did he deliver them to the hand of Joshua. So it's not really an either or situation. Joshua expected the next generation to continue, and God allowed that expectation through Joshua to take place, and so that there was more for them to do, and they chose effectively not to do it. If anything, if I were to come down on one of those two interpretations, I would say the next generation just simply chose not to continue in the path that the previous generation walked. So the earlier generation was, or rather, the earlier responsiveness, the earlier responsiveness was not genuine. We see them in the first 5 verses weeping over what they have done, offering to the Lord, but it's clear from how the reading continues that was not anything that was heartfelt or real. Children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and they began to serve Baals, to begin to serve the lords, the false gods of the world around them. And because Baal is the Hebrew word for Lord. It's the name of a god, but it's also the name of, the way that other religions referred to their gods. And so they serve that, as well as the Ashtoreths, the female counterparts to these Lord gods. And so in doing so, it says, verse 12, they provoked the Lord to anger, and then he delivers them into the hand of plunderers who despoiled them. And whenever they went out, the hand of the Lord was against them for calamity, as the Lord had said, and as the Lord had sworn to them. And they, of course, were greatly distressed. Thus begins sort of this, as I said, this is more of a thematic chapter than it is a chronological chapter. We have a description of how things are going to continue from this point forward, sadly. We find that this sort of cycle that we've talked about previously begins with these decisions that this generation makes. The Lord, they find themselves through their sin and through its attendant consequences in distress. But then the Lord raises up judges who deliver them out of the hand of those who plundered them, verse 16. But then they don't listen to the judges, and then they turn to the gods again and depart from the commandments of the Lord. And then that cycle kind of repeats itself, as it says in these next couple of verses. So if you want scripture to back effectively that chart that we talked about with that cycle, this would be the reading for that. Now, what differs between this chapter and chapter 1, and I think this is worth noting, is that rather than the Lord being with the tribe, it says that the Lord was with the judge. And we start to think, instead of a national faithfulness, unfortunately, we start to think about a righteous remnant. And then, sadly, as the story of the judges continue, we begin to think about really people that are at times used by God, but who do not have real faith in God. We're going to, again, talk about Samson and about what we see in him. And we don't see a depth of faith in him that we might expect from someone whom the Lord is using to deliver his people. But with all of these victories that God brings, God's aware that really, the genuineness of their responsiveness and their crying out to him is not real. And so none of the victories that they win during this period are going to be decisive in any way. In verse 20, the anger of the Lord is against Israel. He says, because this nation has transgressed my covenant, which I commanded their fathers, and not heeded my voice, I will no longer drive out from before them any of the nations which Joshua left when he died, so that through them I may test Israel, whether they will keep the ways of the Lord to walk in them as their fathers kept them or not. And so what could have been driven out was not driven out, and it remains so that they can be tested. And so we'll see power instead of the Israelites consolidating and holding power. We'll see power so often kind of swinging back and forth between the Israelites and the people in the land, and then at times external rulers also who the Lord will bring in to have influence over them. All right, so that's the conclusion of chapter 2. Questions or comments that we have from this? All right, let's go ahead and jump into chapter 3. I entitled this from Conquest to Cohabitation. I know that cohabitation can obviously mean people who are living together, not married, but it can also mean people who are just simply living together. And although so often faithfulness faithlessness implies unhealthy relationships as well. And so we do find that these people are effectively cohabiting with the people that they live amongst in an unhealthy spiritual relational kind of way. So we find that the people that should be driven out aren't driven out. As the text begins, Gentile nations are going to remain in Israel to test them by war. War becomes the crucible in which God both exacts punishment against his people, but also tries or attempts to refine them to make them better, because they're not responsive to other means. So it says in verse 1, these are the nations which the Lord left, that he might test Israel by them, that is, all who had not known any of the wars in Canaan. So there's a little bit of a thought in that, as we talked about during the time of Joshua, that that complacency was already setting in this generation that was coming, and that when you don't know the struggle, you can't appreciate what has been gained through it. And so they don't appreciate what God has given them. And then so God says, well, I'm going to even remove its benefit from you. And instead of being the conquerors over the land, you are going to be people who are subservient to others and be forced to fight them yourselves. So we find that mentioned here in particular are the Philistines, the Canaanites, the Sidonians, the Hivites, and so these nations are mentioned, but these are not going to be the only people that are going to kind of have influence over the Israelites as the text continues. Occasionally, there will be some people that are outside of that kind of sphere that come into it. So God's hope in all of this and doing all of this is stated in verse number 4. He's trying to test them to know whether they would obey the commandments of the Lord, which he commanded their fathers by the hand of Israel. He hopes for obedience. But the reality, as it already says in verse number 6, is disobedience. Instead of being responsive to him, they cohabit. They take their daughters to be their wives and gave their daughters to their sons, and they served their gods. And so these are not people that God had authorized them to marry, and yet they turn their back on God and his will and do so. So you're going to find a sort of narrative formula from this point forward where the Israelites did evil, and then there's the story of a key judge, what I'm going to call a key judge, because you'll find they did evil, the judge comes, and then after him, then they did evil, the key judge, then after him, and so on. So the key judges, in other words, the kind of the ones that are introduced by Israel did evil, and God raised up this person, is Othniel, Ehud, Barak, and Deborah, and then Gideon. And it's funny to think about where Abimelech sits in all of this. We'll talk about that when we get there. Abimelech is a strange judge. There's certainly a degree of continuance between him and Gideon. He's not introduced with either of these formulas, with Israel did evil or after him. There's just Gideon had a son, it's Abimelech, and he becomes a king when he really shouldn't have been. Jephthah and Samson, though, are the ones who round out that list. The after him judges are going to be Shamgar, Abimelech, Tola, Jair, Ibzan, Elon, and Abdon. And for some of those, there literally is just going to be a statement, after him, this person judged for this many years, like not really any time spent. And so that tells you all the more that there is, though I talked about, last time when we were introducing the book of Judges, there is a danger to looking at the book too narratively. In other words, saying that these events always tell the kind of story that we want to tell them. It's certainly purposeful, the judges that they spend time on. There certainly is a reason why time is being spent on them, and why these other stories simply aren't being told in any great detail. So as we get into the beginning of the judges, or at least the key judges, the first story is of Othniel. We've heard about him before. We saw him in chapter 1, and we saw him in Judges 15 as well. The oppressor in this case is Cushan-Rishathaim. Rishathaim, it doesn't get translated in any version because it's kind of a weird nickname. Doubly wicked Cushan, so we don't really know what the first wickedness was or the second one was, but he was really bad. And so a really, really bad guy gets a leg up on the Israelites. And he's from Mesopotamia, which, as we said, sometimes the people are from the area, sometimes they're from outside of the area. The Mesopotamia is that region between Tigris and Euphrates, so like northeast of the land of Israel. But they, trade routes go through Israel, and so they're obviously interested in that land. He comes and he fights against the Israelites, and it says that they are delivered into his hand for some 8 years. But then Othniel comes to the rescue, and it says the Spirit of the Lord came upon him, and he fought, and he won in warfare, which is kind of how we've gotten accustomed to the Lord working his victories. Although, as Judges continues, it's not going to be really the way it goes, very often going forward. So he defeats him through war. The next judge is Ehud, and you'll note like already a marked change between what happens with Othniel and the way he works his victory, and then Ehud and the way he works his victory. So the oppressor this time is Eglon, the king of Moab. And so we've now got the Moabites, properly speaking, are from the other side of the Jordan River, but they encroach on the Israelites' land, and do so with the help of both the Ammonites on that side and the Amalekites. And they go and they oppress the Israelites. Ehud defeats them, but it's not through the muster an army and go fight a battle kind of thing, at least not at first. We see him fashioning a dagger, strapping it to its thigh. He goes in and he pretends to pay tribute to this man. Well, he probably brings some money for real, but he brings tribute to Eglon, the king of Moab. He says, "I've got a secret to tell you." And the king's like, "Well, secret, tell me, everybody leave." I don't know why he thought that was a good idea, but that's what he did. And and so while everyone is out, Ehud comes up to him, takes the dagger from off his thigh, and stabs him. And that's the end. We can see that clearly this person. It's not very often that you have like really morbidly obese people living in this time. It speaks to the kind of person that he was. And so the enemies that God is allowing to defeat his people are not just bad guys. They're really, really bad guys. You have the doubly wicked Cushan, whatever made him 2 times wicked, he was 2 times wicked. And then you have this really large man in a time where that's very hard to do. It's very hard to become a really, really big guy. And so he stabs him, and the sword, the dagger, or whatever, gets caught in his belly. That's how big he is. And so again, he assassinates this guy. But then the typical thing follows. While the people aren't sure of what's going on, with this king who sent them all out, Ehud escapes, musters an army, and then they fight. And without the leadership of their king, he's able to win the day. And the chapter concludes with this, with one of these after him judges, Shamgar. It says in verse 31 that he kills 600 men of the Philistines. Nothing more is said about the oppression the Philistines worked at that time, or about any other circumstances that might have been attendant to that victory. But it's interesting that we move from Othniel, effectively, with a metaphoric real sword, to Ehud with a dagger, to Shamgar with an ox goad. Both, what seems to be in the hands of the people and the way that they are working their victories. It's kind of, there's kind of a grinding down that's happening here in all of this. And so Philistia is the oppressor, and Shamgar defeats them through an ox goad. And just a heads up for the kind of things that we'll probably be asking. We'll ask for you to associate judges with the king and nation that they face. If a king is named, if they're not named, that's okay. So like in this case, Shamgar, the Philistines, Ehud, Eglon, and Moab, and that kind of thing. So that's it's good test kind of fodder. Questions or comments on chapter 3? All right. Well, I think this might be a good time to take our break for tonight. So let's go ahead and put a pause on what we're doing here, and then we'll pick up again in just a few minutes. Okay, we are back and recording again. So let's get into Judges chapter 4. So as we talked about, there's kind of this like digression, in the way that these judges fight and the victories that they win. We go from the typical war and conflict and winning with Othniel to an assassination with Ehud to a farmer with an ox goad and Shamgar, perhaps, at least if he's not a farmer, he certainly used a farming implement rather than any kind of normal weapon of war. When we open up into chapter 4, we find another unconventional pathway to victory in both who is leading at this time and who wins the day for God's people. So the oppressor that's described here in chapter 4 is Jabin of Canaan and his general Sisera. So we find this one of these key cities that was talked about in the book of Joshua, Hatzor, is kind of come to prominence again, and Jabin is ruling from this place. And then the commander of his army is Sisera. And so the reason he's mentioned is because when Sisera dies, basically Jabin's influence is dealt a severe blow, and he doesn't recover from it. So Jabin and Sisera, we probably want you to remember both of those as you're thinking about this particular oppression. But then, rather than having the Israelites crying out to the Lord and all that kind of stuff, we find that leadership has kind of shifted, and the person who is having influence over God's people at this time is Deborah, a woman. And so Deborah, a prophetess, is judging Israel at this time. And how does she do that? She sits under the palm tree, and people come to her and seek her judgment. So that's what judgment looks like, and that's where leadership resides. This is kind of something to take note of, because while this would be nothing new here for today's world, in this day and time, this is not typical. This is not typical for a woman to have this kind of position. It's not typical for thing like where are the men? What are the men doing? Is the question that an ancient reader would have when they hear that name dropping, and then and is that feminine form really a woman? Yes, it's the wife of this guy. Oh, okay. And so they're reading that and going, what's going on here? Now God's desire, even in this time, it's worth noting, is not for Deborah to do the fighting. God's desire is for a man named Barak to fight. And so we find that Deborah sends and calls for Barak, one of the people from the tribe of Naphtali, to fight. And has not the Lord God of Israel commanded, go, deploy troops, fight, 10,000 men. He's got he's supposed to muster the army and go and fight. And but Barak is told that, and he's told by God, and in this prophetic, utterance, against you I will deploy Sisera, the commander of Jabin's army, with his chariots and his multitude. And so even though he goes on to say, I will deliver him into your hand, you get a sense of who Barak is and where the men are at this time in kind of the way he responds. He doesn't hear so much the I will deliver him into your hand. He hears more this guy and his army, this terrible general and his armaments are going to come against me. And so Barak's attitude in verse 8 is, well, if you'll go with me, I'll go. But if you will not go with me, I'll not go. And so, it's like it's showing his lack of responsiveness to God, first of all, but then also his cowardice when previous generations understood that God's role was for men to do this and not for women. When you see in the book of Joshua, when those in chapter 1, when the tribes that are on the other side of the River Jordan respond to Joshua's call to fight, they leave the women and children behind. They go and fight. That's the way it was in these days. Like I said, I know that we're very far removed from these kind of things in our world. We're used to women fighting. We're used to women being a part of armed forces, but it just was not a thing in the ancient world to any great degree, and certainly not amongst God's people typically. So Barak has a bad attitude about it. It's probably indicative of where men are at in general in Deborah's time, but his attitude changes the shape, perhaps, of what God does in bringing this enemy to defeat. In verse 9, she says, well, I'll go with you, but there will be no glory for you in the journey you are taking, for the Lord will sell Sisera into the hand of a woman. And so that's the way we're going to have victory at this time, through the hand of woman. And so we find out how that works later on. Now, knowing what we know about God's desire for leadership and gender roles in the New Testament, what does this text teach us, do you think? What are we meant to learn as New Testament readers of this text? Well, what is God's desire for gender roles in and amongst his people today?
That men be the leader and women and children be minors.
Well, not minors, so to speak. So no, my wife is not on par with my sons and my daughter, but there is a different role for her in our family. So Ephesians chapter 5,
Yeah.
you
Men
know,
be the main hand of the family, and women be wives and children.
yeah, women are supposed to be wives and children are supposed to be children. Well, yeah, that's true. In 1 Corinthians chapter 11, you have this, that this statement about the head of every woman is man, and you have that kind of described a little bit more in terms of the family, and also in terms of the church in passages like Ephesians 5 and 6, and then also 1 Timothy chapter 3. In Ephesians 5, in terms of the family, women are supposed to be responsive to their husband's wishes and guiding the home. And while the husband is likewise called to be, allowing his wishes to be shaped by her genuine needs and to be sacrificial as relates to those needs, he's only called to submit to her needs, and she is called to submit to his headship. And then in the next chapter that talks about children, like Joey said, the role of children is to be submissive to their parents. Children, obey your parents in the Lord. But as relates to responsibility within the family, it goes on to say in verse number 4 that fathers are the ones who are to bring up their children in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. So God expects men to take the role of leadership within the home. And that's mirrored in what happens in the church. In 1 Timothy, I said chapter 3, but chapter 2, in 1 Timothy chapter 2, God's will is for men to lead the assembled church in prayer, and also for women to not take roles of teaching or of authority in and amongst God's people when there are both genders present. So that's what's said. So I think knowing that, if you all don't have any thoughts that you want to share at this time, knowing that when we read this text, we're seeing a man not being what he ought to be. We're seeing a woman who's forced to do what she's not called to do. And both in terms of her judging and in terms of her being a prophetess and publicly being the one to convey this information. And then further, in being called even to go into battle, because the man won't go by himself. It's just not what's supposed to happen. And so I think that, obviously the lesson is that God will find a way forward, and has had to do so in many cases through godly women. I think about Timothy even, and how the faith that dwelled in him sadly was not a faith that dwelled in his father, but instead, as Paul said, dwelled in his mother and grandmother. God can find a way forward to achieve his ends, but still, it's just kind of sad when it has to happen that way. And I'm not saying it's sad that you have really strong, faithful Christian women out there. What I'm saying is that God has called men to be more than what we see in Barak. and more than just this man who's like, well, I'll only go if you go with me, kind of thing. He's supposed to be a leader, and that's even what God desires for him, clearly. And so when we don't stand up and do what God calls us to do, at the very least, glory will be lost, and potentially, as you think about the New Testament's instructions, a lot more. If God's desire is for men to serve in these leadership roles, what happens when we don't do what God desires? I don't think enough time is spent through modern Christianity, so to speak, or so-called Christianity. Not enough time is spent on that thought. What happens when we don't do what God has stated and what He has, discussed and desired and desire. So, any other thoughts on Deborah and Barak here? All right. So, what happens? Well, deliverance does come. We find that Barak musters the army. He moves to attack, but we can kind of get a sense of not only where the men are, but where the Israelites are in general. So either they're in fear of, or they're in collusion with the enemy. It's really sad that the Israelites used to be this people that were drawing people out of the nations into the people of God. Now we have Heber the Kenite, who is of the children of Hobab, the father-in-law of Moses. We know him as Jethro elsewhere, obviously, but we find that this people who had been kind of brought into Israel through the efforts of Moses, now they are we've got this traitor coming from this group of people who goes and reports to Sisera about Barak's movements and all of that. And so we find Sisera is able to gather his chariots, and he knows where Barak is going to be and brings his people there. Now, having brought his people there, evidently God was aware of all of this, and that doesn't come as a surprise to us. It would come as a surprise to an ancient reader that what actually ends up happening. Usually, if you have chariots and the other guy doesn't, you win. But he brings his chariots, and obviously they were in such a position so as to not be, so as to be more of a what's the word? More of a hindrance at the very least. There's another word that I'm thinking of, but anyway, more of a hindrance than a help at this time. So we find that the battle begins, and the chariots are there, but Deborah says to Barak, attack. He does so, and the enemy is routed, and the chariots are abandoned. So Sisera runs from his chariot and flees on foot, and Barak is chasing chariots, which is just not something that's typical in ancient warfare. He pursues the chariots in the army. So Sisera's
chariots be pursuing land foot soldiers.
Yeah, usually it'd be the other way, that the chariots would be chasing the people, the foot soldiers. But the foot soldiers in this case are chasing the chariots. It says that Barak pursued the chariots in the army and are attacking them with the edge of the sword. Not a man is left. But Sisera, he finds his way into the tent of a woman named Jael. And so he goes into this tent, and she's like, "Oh, come on in." And he says, "Can I have something to drink?" And he says he wants some water. But she's clever and knows what moms know today, that kid wakes up in the night, maybe the thing to give him is milk, because milk has tryptophan in it. Even though they wouldn't have known that term back then, they do know that milk helps you go to sleep. So she gives him some milk, and then he's like, "Can you go and guard the tent? And if anybody says I'm here, then tell them no." And so she does that, and then he falls asleep. And so she goes back in and takes a tent peg, and then just drive the tent peg through his head, and that's it. And so a rather unglorious end to a really, really, what was for the men a really, really scary guy, and such a simple way, such a tremendous threat to God and His people to come to an end. And so Barak comes to find out about this, And then that is the beginning of the end for Jabin's influence. As I said, without Sisera is the general. Jabin's influence is weakened, and ultimately he is defeated, and this threat comes to an end. So, what questions do we have about chapter 4? Comments?
That is just one way to go for Sisera.
Yeah, I mean,
such an embarrassment.
it
Killed
would.
by a lady, which is unarmed.
Yeah, it was certainly, it would have been a very embarrassing way for somebody to end in a world that cared about how these things happened, and then but all the more, again, if God wants to defeat someone, it doesn't take very much, does it? A tent peg in this case, a stone in the case of Goliath, or and you can think about any number of people who've been such big threats and so seemingly undefeatable, and then brought down by so little. Satan defeated through the cross, and so on and on we could go.
I think there's an interesting little parallel here between Barak and, so he is, in part a faithful child of God, right? He's a member of the children of Israel, and he, kind of mostly does what he's told, even though he's, drags his feet about it. And so he gets, that by the work of a woman, essentially, he's going to lose his glory there. But then the person who's the actual enemy of God and enemy of God's people, certainly, as Joey mentioned, loses his life in a, ignoble way there. So, it's a shame to the man, Barak there, but even more so to Sisera, right? Right. Even the least of the, faithful of God is still miles ahead of the, greatest general of the enemies of God there.
Yeah, absolutely. So we have, and do you have anyone else have any other thoughts they wanted to share? We have in the next chapter something a little bit unusual for the book of Judges, or even Joshua for that matter, where such is the victory that's won, that we have the record of a psalm. And so the last time that perhaps in terms of history we would have seen something like this would be the Song of the Sea, when the Egyptians were drowned in the sea and the Israelites are celebrating on the other side. So we can see what this victory meant at this time. And it's all the more sad that even though this was clearly a great victory, they sing this song, and then unfortunately the second verse is the same as the first. They go back to their cowering in fear, and men not being who they ought to be, as we get that back to the story of Gideon. But in the meantime, let's talk about the song. So in the song, kind of as so often these victory hymns do, it starts with the end. And so we see, as the song begins, a story of the end. And so in verse number 2, when leaders lead in Israel, when the people willingly offer themselves, bless the Lord. And so even within the that first line, when the leaders lead, well, not quite what we saw. Barak should have been more of the leader than he was, and yet with what little leadership he was willing to put forward, there's the opportunity for good things to happen. And so leaders need to lead, and the people need to willingly offer themselves. This promotes an environment where the Lord can be properly praised. Bless the Lord is a statement that refers not to our attempt to confer any kind of benefit to the Lord, but rather because he has conferred a benefit to us, to render him the praise that he's due. So in verse 3, hear, O kings, give ear, O princes. Even I, will sing to the Lord. I will sing praise to the Lord God of Israel. Is the I, even I, well, who is that? Deborah and Barak? No, doesn't actually say. So it's interesting to think about who's the perspective in some of these statements. But anyway, Lord, when you went out from Seir, when you marched from the field of Edom, the earth trembled, the heavens poured, the clouds also gushed water. The mountains gushed before the Lord, this Sinai before the Lord God of Israel. In this early example of Israelite poetry, you see some of the kind of themes that you will end up seeing in the book of Psalms. When mountains are pictured, for example, in the book of Psalms, these are symbols of strength and of power. And so when the mountains are like gushing before the Lord and join with the earth trembling, when things that are normally strong, secure, and stable aren't that way, it's a significant thing, either because a power structure is falling away, or in this case, because a superior power structure is there, or a more powerful thing is there in the case of God. So God comes, and as we illustrate his powerfulness, the earth's quaking, the mountains are gushing or melting, as so often is found in the book of Psalms. So as the text continues, you have a picture of the conditions before the battle in verse 6, in the days of Shamgar, the son of Anath, in the days of Jael. So you see the elevation of Jael for her role and the glory that's already going to her in the psalm. Highways were deserted. The travelers walked along the byways. Village life had ceased. It ceased in Israel. People couldn't live and do what they normally did until Deborah, arose a mother in Israel. And so though Barak is singing, again, you can see that Deborah is the one to whom more glory is going. And in verse 8, they chose new gods. Then there was a war in the gates. Not a shield or spear was seen among 40,000 in Israel. Because of their choice of new gods, they had no way of defending themselves. And that further explains, Shamgar doing what he did with the ox goad. But after the description of those conditions, they have a call to action in verse 9. My heart is with the rulers of Israel who offered themselves willingly with the people. Bless the Lord. Speak you who ride on white donkeys, who sit in judges' attire, and who walk along the road, far from the noise of the archers among the watering places. There they shall recount the righteous acts of the Lord, the righteous acts for his villagers in Israel. Then the people of the Lord shall go down to the gates. So, as we've already said, the men aren't where they need to be or doing what they need to be doing. And so there's this call or reminder of what was needed to call them. The people needed to offer themselves willingly. The rulers needed to not be in far off places, but needed to be aware of what was going on. And as verse 12 says, they needed to awake. Awake, Deborah, awake, Barak, and achieve what you want to achieve. And so the survivors finally come down, and the Lord, because the survivors came down, the Lord comes down in verse 13 against the mighty forces. So in responding to the call for action, there can be what's pictured there in verse 11, the ability for them to look forward in faith to a time when they'll look back in victory. So in verses 14 through 18, you find ultimately then the response of the people. From Ephraim were those whose roots were in Amalek. After you, Benjamin, with your peoples. From Machir, rulers came down. And from Zebulun, those who bear the recruiter's staff. And the princes of Issachar with Deborah, as Issachar, so was Barak. And so that's where Barak sits in all of that, by the way, again. So he's just along with the people who were with Deborah. Sent into the valley under his command, under the divisions of Reuben, there were great resolves of heart. And so the question then is, with this response and with this potential, why did you sit among the sheepfolds to hear the pipings of the flocks? And so this could have been here all along. The divisions of Reuben have great searchings of heart as they reflect upon that question. Gilead stayed beyond the Jordan. Why did Dan remain on the ships? Asher continued at the seashore and stayed by his inlets. Zebulun is a people who have jeopardized their lives to the point of death. Naphtali also on the heights of the battlefield. And so in the recounting of what happened, you see who responded and you see who didn't. You don't see a unified effort amongst God's people. You find some are not fighting, but then you find some who are willing to die for what they now believe in. Some are forced to be introspective, like Reuben was, and yet some are there with resolve. So that's the response, and then the battle is recorded. The kings came and fought in verse 19, the kings of Canaan in Taanach by the waters of Megiddo. They took no spoils of silver. They fought from the heavens. The stars from their courses fought against Sisera. And so heaven was moving against this enemy. The torrent of Kishon swept them away. The ancient torrent, the torrent of Kishon, oh my soul, march on in strength. And so effectively, the picture of a river flooding is the way that they're able to describe this victory. The horses' hooves pounded, galloping the steeds as they're running away effectively. Curse Meroz, said the angel of the Lord, curse its inhabitants bitterly because they did not come to the help of the Lord, to the help of the Lord against the mighty. And again, all the more people being condemned in this poem for not being involved as they ought to have been involved. It's interesting in a song like this, which is a celebration. In celebration, there's still that thought given towards admonition. I find in modern hymn writing that kind of goes lacking sometimes, doesn't it? When you try to think about and the aim is still there, teaching and admonishing one another in psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs, Ephesians 5:19. When you think about modern hymns, how many hymns do you know of that are truly admonishing, and or even the kind of words that we see here, like truly rebuking of anyone for doing anything? Is like you're like scratching your head. I know I've sat down and thought about it a few times, and I'm like, well, you have what angry words, that hymn, that's kind of a little bit of a negative admonishment kind of thing. But then besides that, the list gets pretty short pretty fast, of the ways that we encourage each other in song. I always try to say this, I'm hoping, and if I say it enough times, that I'll strike a chord with somebody who has some poetic giftedness. We definitely need a more well-rounded work to be done in our hymns. We just don't see a lot of we don't see hardly any admonishment, any negative instruction. Just doesn't happen very much in the songs that we sing at church. And too often, sadly, what we do is we borrow from the work of the world around us, and they are where they are for a reason. And sometimes the songs that we sing actually can have words and phrases and things that convey messages that might mean something different than we think they mean, at least to the original writers. And so we need people to write songs, is the long and short thing that I'm trying to say there. But anyway, so the battle is fought, and we now have a story, because a battle is finally fought, a story of people being defeated. Yes, not everyone was involved in the battle that should have been. Yes, they didn't respond in the way they should have, or as early as they should have. But simply coming to God and doing as He says will always, achieve fruit. And so, a picture of the defeated, is a picture, summed up in Sisera and in the work of Jael. And so, most blessed among women is Jael, the wife of Heber the Kenite. Blessed is she among women in the tents. He asked for water, she gave him milk. She brought out cream in a lordly bowl. He couldn't resist himself when he saw the nice bowl of cream. And so she stretched her hand out to the tent peg, her right hand to the workman's hammer. She pounded Sisera. She pierced his head. She split and struck through his temple. And at her feet he sank. He fell. He lay still. At her feet he sank. He fell. Where he sank, there he fell dead. So again, the glory going to Jael, and if you were to give glory to another person in this, Deborah and Barak, somewhere way down on the list. Sisera, it's kind of an interesting thing pictured here, and as you're thinking about the practicality of having pictured this, there would be a reminder to every woman and mother who heard this, how we need to keep obeying God so that our wives and mothers don't have to live this reality. The mother of Sisera looks through the window, cries out through the lattice, Why is this chariot so long in coming? Why tarries the clatter of his chariots? Her wisest ladies answered her, yes, she answered herself. Are they not finding and dividing the spoil? To every man a girl or two. For Sisera, plunder of dyed garments, plunder of garments embroidered and dyed, 2 pieces of dyed embroidery for the neck of the looter. This is the way that the mom clearly viewed her son. Why is he taking so long in coming back? He must be stealing some more stuff from some more Israelites, and yet couldn't be any further from reality, obviously. We don't want our moms looking in vain for the return of a son, but then also we get a sense of why Sisera had this coming to him in the first place. And so in the conclusion, may God's victories continue. Thus let all your enemies perish, O Lord, but let those who love him be like the sun when it comes out in full strength. And it says the land had rest for 40 years. So questions or comments on the song of Barak and Deborah?
It doesn't sound like Barak is singing at all. It's all Deborah and woman.
Yeah, it does seem to have more of Deborah's perspective. But that would be not surprising, given that she is the prophetess in this time, and the glory was going to go to her and to women more so than to Barak and men.
Yeah, when Barak got told that he would lose out on the glory, he did seem to at least accept that in good grace and give credit where credit was due. So he, even if he wussed out, at least then after the fact, he didn't try to pretend like he had carried the team the whole way through. So that's one thing going for him, or at least one vice he did not have.
Yeah, right. All right. Well, let's jump into chapter 6. We won't get through all of Gideon, but we'll see if we can't get through this first chapter about Gideon. So last we saw, in terms of where men are and how they are behaving, we saw Barak not behaving very well, not behaving like a leader of men, even though that was what he was called to be. We find another oppression comes, and we find men as they were during the time of Barak. There isn't even a woman who is leading and judging God's people, and the leader that God has to pick is a man that's truly chosen out of obscurity, as we're going to find. The Midianites are the oppressor in this case. In the first 6 verses, that's described. Also, it says in the Amalekites, but the Midianites are kind of described as the chief oppressor. Before God delivers the people, he actually sends a prophet with some pretty choice words to speak to the time and to speak to what's going on here. So it says they cry to the Lord, verse number 7, and then the Lord sends a prophet in verse 8, who says to them, thus says the Lord God of Israel, I brought you up from Egypt and brought you out of the house of bondage. So again, you were brought out of this. You're not supposed to be living in this. I delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians and out of the hand of all who oppressed you, and drove them out before you and gave you their land. And also I said to you, I am the Lord your God. Do not fear the gods of the Amorites in whose land you dwell, but you have not obeyed my voice. What you find as you jump into the story of Gideon is a man who really is afraid, and there's this sort of reality that kind of comes to the front with the story of Gideon, and that is that when we don't fear God, we will always end up fearing something. In verse number 11, it says that as Gideon is called, it says, now the angel of the Lord came and sat under the terebinth tree, which was in Ophrah, which belonged to Joash the Abiezerite, while his son Gideon threshed wheat in the winepress in order to hide it from Midianites. We didn't read the first 6 verses, but the kind of the thing that the Midianites would do is they would let the Israelites grow the crops, and they'd come in and take everything. And so here we have a man who's so afraid of them doing that he's hiding in a wine press in a big vat where they would stomp down the grapes, and hiding there and like secretly threshing this little bit of wheat that he has, which would not have been easy one for him to do, because the aim in threshing is to try to separate the grain from the chaff. And so it would have been easy for him to do that. And it's also kind of just a strange picture, a man is hiding and scared of what to him is a big bully. So he's afraid of them. And that's because, as was said in verse number 10, he didn't fear God. When the Israelites fear God, they have nothing to fear. I think about the New Testament passage in 1 John 4:18, that perfect love casts out fear. Embracing God with a proper and appropriate respect, which is sometimes called fear, keeps us from enduring any other kind of fear. Respect God, and there's nothing to be afraid of. So, though he sits there in the winepress in cowardice and in fear, it's interesting how God sees potential in him. And rather than calling a woman to awaken to his sentimentalities, as he does with Deborah and Barak, we find an angel coming and pronouncing God's estimation of this man who clearly doesn't see this in himself. Verse 12, the angel of the Lord appears to him and says to him, "The Lord is with you, mighty man of valor." He's there hiding, threshing out his wheat there in the wine press, and the Lord yet says to him, "Mighty man of valor." Now, what follows is, Gideon almost doesn't hear the mighty man of valor part. He focuses in on the Lord is with you part, and he disputes it. And that really is the way that it works. When we don't feel God is with us, then we will not value ourselves or see in ourselves what is potential in us. So Gideon says to him, "Oh, my Lord, if the Lord is with us, then why has all this happened? And where are all his miracles which our fathers told us about, saying, did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt? Now the Lord has forsaken us, and we are delivered in the hand of the Midianites." That's so incredibly relevant when you think about the way that we process things today. It's been so long since the time of the miracles. It's been so long since God did these certain things. And if we're not careful, that distance that we have from the miraculous can cause us to doubt who God is and what God has done, and to cause us to instead begin to interpret our problems as though they are in some way greater than the God that we serve. If you're with us, why has this happened to us? Well, really, God is always with us in potential, and it is our fear that places us with him. So really what Gideon should be examining is his own placement before God, rather than where God has or hasn't been during this time. God is consistent. It is humans who aren't. And so yet still, the Lord, kind of brushes that off, and again states what he sees in Gideon. The Lord turns to him through the angel and says, "Go in this might of yours, and you shall save Israel from the hand of the Midianites. Haven't I sent you? What are you worried about? You want me to act? Go, do, believe what I have said. Go in might. I've said you're a mighty man of valor. Go in might." And of course, in verse 15, if it's not the external that is causing him to be afraid, then it's the internal. "Oh, my Lord, how can I save Israel? Indeed, in my clan, I am the weakest. My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my father's house." So we have the weakest of the weakest, effectively. And he just doesn't believe that he can do what God, believes he can do. And so what we find is Gideon asking for the first of what will be, three signs. In verses 17 through 22, he says, "Do me a sign." And so Gideon goes, he brings the sacrifice back, and the sign will be ultimately that the Lord burns up his sacrifice, consuming, it says in verse 21, the angel touches the meat and the unleavened bread. The fire rose out of the rock and consumed the meat and the unleavened bread. And then the angel departed, and Gideon is convinced that he's seen something. Though he is convinced that he has seen something, he's still not quite convinced in God, as we're going to find. And he has to defeat some enemies within. You can say that those are enemies within his own house and amongst his own people, but maybe they're enemies in his own perceptions. Gideon has to deal with sin in his family. We find that the Lord first tells him that he needs to tear down the image that his father has set up of a false god, a Baal. And so he does that, but he does it in fear. It says in verse 27 that he does this it says, because he feared his father's household in the midst of the city too much to do it by day, he did it at nighttime. And so that's kind of the compromise. All right, I'll do what God wants me to do, but I'll do it at nighttime. I don't know, why Nicodemus went at night to go see Jesus. But I know later on in chapter 12, when he has the opportunity to speak a word for Jesus in the Sanhedrin, that he's afraid to do so. And so it's kind of telling that sometimes people think that the nighttime is good enough. But what God calls his people to do is to live as children of day and to not act in fear at any time. 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, of course, is the reference that I was alluding to in that. But his father, surprisingly, after all of this, they say, who's done this? And it's Gideon who did this, and let's bring him out and let's get him, and yet they actually want to kill him. It says in verse number 30, bring out your son that he may die. He's torn down the altar of Baal. But Joash actually stands up for him and makes a very common sense point that the Israelites really should have been considering before this point. Would you plead for Baal? Would you save him? Let the one who would plead for him be put to death by morning. For if he is a god, let him plead for himself, because his altar has been torn down. And that's the thing they should have realized about the difference between the God that they served and those things that they were purporting to be gods. The reality that was found in God and the lack of any power or any reality in the false gods. So he has to defeat these enemies within in order to set himself up to defeat the enemies without. He assembles an army, but still, like I said, there's still something inside of him that needs to be convinced. And so Gideon asks for two more signs. One where he places fleece on the ground, and if there's dew on the fleece only, then and it's dry everywhere else, then I'll know that that you're the one that you're going to save Israel by my hand. That happens, and he says, well, how about you wet the entire ground and then let the fleece be dry? And God is still willing to do that. I really appreciate that, even though clearly God has been hurt by his people, I appreciate the time and effort that God is willing to put into this man. And it's all the more sad where we will ultimately see the story of Gideon go. Though he is going to, as we're going to find out in the next chapter, though he is going to be a part of a courageous victory for God and his people, at the end of that story, we're not going to see him reward fully the faith that God had in him. And we'll talk about that, Lord willing, next time. So any questions over chapter 6 before we wrap up for tonight? Okay. All right. Well, let's maybe then just go ahead and close out with a word of prayer. Most holy God, we are so thankful for the value that you see in each person. We're thankful that when we look at ourselves and we see our deficiencies and our lack of ability, you see strength that you can utilize for your glory and for our good. We thank you that for those of us who are in Christ, that you have blessed us with a role in the body to fulfill, that though you teach us that we depend upon others and certainly depend upon our head, Jesus, that we have strength and we have ability, and that can be utilized provided that we fear only you and that we don't allow ourselves to be controlled by our circumstances, by our failures, or by anything else. Father, we thank you for how you worked with Gideon and how you raised him to, or how you will raise him in our study to a position of faith and a position of victory. We thank you also for what we were able to look at in the other examples that we considered, for the victories that you worked through the many individuals that we talked about tonight. But we also, Father, we read about Deborah and Barak, and we think about the roles of the church, and we think about how though We need strong women. We also need very active men. And so we pray that you will please help the men of the church to not behave as Barak did, and that you will help them to be what you have called them to be. And though we pray, Father, for our sisters to gain all the more strength so that they can stand up when the brothers simply will not. We thank you, God, for your blessings and for what you've taught us this evening. And we offer this prayer in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. Okay. We will go ahead and stop for tonight. Thank you so much.